Thanks again for joining, and for anyone who has just joined, welcome. And this is a lunchtime webinar. We've kind of started doing these at Native events just to, I suppose, communicate what we're up to and talk about sustainability and kind of practice what we preach on that front. And I think that's particularly poignant here with this specific webinar. So I'm excited to kind of present our thoughts. We had some interesting discussions as a team about sustainability communications and greenwashing, which kind of helped to shape this webinar. So it's not just my point of view, but it's Native Events' point of view. So I'm kind of, we're thinking about communications as well, not just greenwashing, thinking about how you speak to your peers, your clients, your collaborators about climate and sustainability, as well as kind of decoding those narratives that actually matter and those that maybe are kind of influencing us in the wrong direction. So yeah, as Aziz is here, Kira is here, we're going to have that fire chat at the end. So I'm really looking forward to that. And before we kick off, I'm just going to give a little bit of an introduction to myself. I think that's kind of important to give some context and my journey into the sustainability space, because it's kind of all relevant in terms of communications and how we present ourselves and speak about things in the world. So I kind of started off my journey with the festival industry, and I've kind of moved into the arts and cultural space since then. But going way back to my kind of younger years, I've always been somebody who's very interested in nature and outdoor activities, feeling very connected to it intrinsically. And more than that, though, also with people. So I'm someone who's always loved bringing people together. And that's kind of how I ended up in the live music space. It's something that I've kind of always loved. And so I went on to study event management back in 2015. I did a 4-year degree in it. And what I really found was that, there was a lot of amazing work that we were doing on that course, but there was also a little bit of a hesitation to have discussions around things that were maybe less appetizing to discuss things like that were a little bit conflicting. And we were in a space where there was so much going on in the world at the time, as is now, that it felt to me like there was just a bit of an elephant in the room all of the time. And I've included here the Sustainable Event Management book from Megan Jones because that was kind of my Bible at the time. It was the only piece of academic content that I had to really refer to. And so I started looking into this more and more, and I decided to do my thesis on the drivers and the barriers for organizers in the industry, and including sustainability in their work. Why is it that they were doing things, certain things, maybe talking about certain things and not other things? And that led me to find Native Events, where I have been since. And what I realized quickly was that there was a huge amount of industry knowledge and industry activity, but not so much academic. So I really wanted to focus in on this. And I'm pleased to say that since then, there's been a huge amount of work done from an academic point of view on sustainability as well, even particularly in communications and marketing too. So the last 10 years, my focus has really been on sustainability, and I've been having constant conversations, and I've been running into many, many different conflicts around it as well, where, I think sometimes when you work in a sustainability space, people often point and they often ask really difficult questions and expect you to know the answer to everything. And I think from an organizational perspective, that's often the case too. So we're going to kind of jump into that a little bit and understand what that means for us and how we can approach it. So when we think about the connection between culture and sustainability, it's important to remind ourselves why this actually matters in the first place. So first of all, every person in every industry has a responsibility to act, So yes, there are some industries that are more damaging than others and emitting significantly more CO2, but ultimately everybody needs to collectively make changes to build that momentum at the pace that we need now, to really, I suppose, show what can be done and get other people to get on board. The second part of this is that culture is intrinsically part of who we are. It's part of our psyche. It's influencing our choices from the day we are born and on our behaviors individually and collectively. And so we need to kind of act because the climate crisis and all of these other kind of crises are unfortunately worsening. And while sometimes we can feel completely helpless, something as simple as how we kind of speak about things, how we act, and how we show up in the world can really make a difference to the action and I suppose what follows that. So at the UN Conference of Parties, or COP28, which most people are familiar with, culture was kind of finally recognized as a crucial actor in achieving effective, sustainable solutions to the climate crisis. So this is a really significant thing that happened. It was really important. It meant that there was a buy-in on an international front, that people were starting to really understand that cultural narrative is driving us into certain behaviors. And we need to address this in order to make real change on a societal level. Um, But what is culture? So thinking about what culture is in relation to the organizations that we're with, I know there's a multitude of different people on this call from different backgrounds, from different industries. So let's think about that while we're going through this. What are the cultural narratives within your organizations or within the industry that you're working with? So culture is largely intangible, but it influences everything around us. So the values, the belief, the language, as I said, the behaviors that we share in common, they kind of define us collectively. It's as simple as endlessly offering people who come into your home a cup of tea. It's as old and ancient as Irish dancing. And then it's also as damaging and as complex as how we make decisions around littering. So I always like to use the cigarette example because for some reason, some, groups of people totally normalize throwing a cigarette on the ground, but that same person may never throw a piece of plastic wrapping on the ground. There's this cultural narrative around cigarettes, which has been depicted in television and films as a normal thing to do, as a cool thing to do, often depicted with certain types of characteristics and traits of certain people. So that's a really interesting kind of point. And I wonder now at this point in the chat, like if anyone's thinking, are there any cultural narratives or norms or activities similar to that that are equally as damaging that people have normalized that kind of stick out for you? I'd be interested to kind of hear and maybe discuss that at the end. Um, so it's time for us to really talk about the cultural narrative around the environment. It's very much, we've seen it in particular in the creative industries be a very important driver for change in relation to gender and race and sexual inequality historically. But the environment really needs to be part of this conversation as well in a very big and serious way. And there's a few different ways that creatives have been doing this and influencing the cultural narrative. And we're seeing more and more people in the arts and music and the wider creative sector, particularly those with platforms, kind of speaking out about the climate crisis and other social and political issues. So we see here just on the screen, we have Fontaine's DC calling out the government on climate action. Or the rest of us will have no future. These are pretty bold statements, okay? And we're also seeing a lot in the media right now around political discourse and other issues that are happening worldwide and people really using their platforms. And you might kind of think, why does this matter? Fontaine's DC are a band and they're speaking out and they're asking the government to act. Why does this actually make a difference? So why talk about it at all? Well, talking about it as a starting point really helps on a very, very basic level in our day-to-day conversations in our organizations, in industries, using our platforms on a wider level publicly. It's a really, really important step in normalizing sustainability actions, activism, and conversations, allowing for more of it to take place. The more that you speak about it, the more others are going to feel comfortable speaking about it. It also holds you to it holds you accountable. It holds other people accountable. So giving an example here, maybe of like you might be communicating some of the actions you're taking as an organization, and that means that okay, well, you've kind of gone out and said that now, so you really need to act on it. So that's an important kind of piece to look at as well. And just by talking about it, we're integrating it more into our actions and we're manifesting it. So talking about the types of futures that we want to see in the world will help us really bring that to life. And on an organizational level, something that I think all of us struggle with, again, well, not even organizational, but on an individual level as well, is showing your values. So, I can't count how many times when we've gone out looking for partners or collaborators, or maybe there's a client that wants to work with us, and it's really hard for us to actually understand what they care about. So showing your values from a business perspective is also really important. It can help people to connect with you and understand whether or not you align with each other. And again, the more organizations are doing that, the better it will be, the more other people will be held accountable to also have to kind of act in a certain way. I added in this photo here, it's just from a festival a while ago. It's a weird one because again, we didn't have to talk about this. We made a sign that said no native trees were harmed in the making of this fire. This fire is fueled by cherry laurel, a harmful invasive species removed by our forests. To anybody walking past without that sign, it's just a fire. But adding in this sign meant that people were actually learning something, they were engaging something, they were seeing, and we were showing the values that this festival that we had this fire at had, which was we don't want to burn native trees, we don't want to buy imported wood. We're actually looking at other solutions. We're trying to be the solutions as much as possible. So sorry.
Sorry.
Oh, so in your industry or line of work, have you kind of ever struggled to understand the values of a company or has it been easy, or how has it kind of impacted your relationship with them? So again, if you want to think about that and add it to the chat, and it's something we can discuss at the end, I'd be really interested to hear. Or maybe the organization that you work for isn't doing that at the moment, and you can start thinking about how you might begin to show your values. So now I want to talk about greenwashing, which is part of kind of why we're here today. Greenwashing narratives versus language. Okay, so there's two different things to look at here. So I'm going to give some examples of greenwashing narratives that we hear time and time again. And while I'm doing that again, I'd be keen to hear other greenwashing narratives that are kind of staring us in the face, any that you're kind of experiencing on a day-to-day basis or potentially within your organization. So let's talk about recycling. This is definitely a difficult and challenging and annoying one that I know at Native Events that we really, really struggle with. There is often a narrative push that recycling will save us, and it gets so much attention in the media, and it's positioned as this kind of big sustainable win. But while recycling does have a place in our world, and it very much does, that place is really only valuable if we start reducing single-use materials, we stop extracting resources, and we eliminate plastic entirely. So we need to think about who is pushing the recycling narrative. When we break it down, with recycling, for example, looking at even just the emissions, so we're not talking about necessarily pollution or ocean plastics or anything like that, and well-being and health, but when we look at the emissions from the More Circularity, Less Carbon report from the regional waste offices, it shows that while carbon savings associated with recycling, which is shown in red at the bottom here, are greater than the carbon footprint associated, for example, with the incineration and landfill, what we're seeing in the middle there is actually that the carbon emissions that are generated from the extraction of resources, the manufacturing of materials, and the creation of waste far exceeds those savings again. So this is that evidence there that says, okay, well, why are we constantly talking about recycling if recycling isn't actually going to measure up against the amount of carbon emissions that are generated from material extraction and the creation of stuff, of which there is so much in this world, packaging, all of these kind of things, then why are we not talking about eliminating plastics more? Why are we not talking about reducing what we buy, reducing waste, reducing materials, and reusing, and that circular kind of economy push? And what we're finding is more and more, yeah, more and more people and experts in this space are calling this out, and they're saying the EPA reports are showing that there's that growing gap to close on circularity in Ireland. The waste volumes are continuing to increase. So it's no good to increase recycling if the waste volumes are continuing to increase. We need to move away from incineration and exporting waste, and we need to close the circularity gap. So that's an interesting one, and it's a narrative that's constantly kind of looked at. Another one that we could think about really is a common greenwashing narrative is this statement that everyone should own an EV. Who is saying this and why? Think about it. What are the people that are advertising to you actually trying to do here? They might be trying to sell you a car. So it's important to question and be curious and critical in your analysis of what you're dealing with on a daily basis. Maybe it's not owning an EV. Maybe it's that we need improved public transport. Maybe we need less cars on the road, and maybe we need to be advocating and actively looking for that in our society and pushing our governments in that kind of direction. And then the other piece with greenwashing, of course, is language. So, going back to what greenwashing is, it's where an organization gives the impression of being environmentally friendly when in fact they aren't. The other piece that happens sometimes with greenwashing, which is important to note, is that sometimes it happens by accident. Sometimes what you have is a department of like communications or marketing, for example, that just aren't quite tied in or understanding enough with the values of the company or the actions that are being taken. So it's really important for your sustainability department or whoever's heading up the operations or doing those activities to connect in with the communications and marketing department. And I'll talk a little bit more about that with some of the tips and tricks, I suppose, that I can give on how to communicate. But yeah, H&M is a classic example of greenwashing. I suppose they have their conscious collection. What does conscious mean? In this, it's very, very vague. It's very, very fluffy. They kind of made some claims around having a percentage of the materials of this collection being recycled, and it turned out that it was significantly lower than what they had advertised. So they were directly greenwashing from a factual perspective, but then also conscious collection, very fluffy, very vague, massive fashion giant. So that's an interesting one as well. And a lot of this is extremely obvious, and I think a lot of people will know this, but it's important to kind of understand how we can assess and like look at this on a day-to-day basis and be conscious of it as we move through the world in our organizations and individually. So when we're thinking about responding to greenwashing, what should and shouldn't we be allowed to say? How can we respond to greenwashing narratives or check ourselves in these moments? Well, firstly, just up until this week, there was due to be an EU anti-greenwashing bill, which has now been axed due to Italy pulling out. I'm not entirely thrilled about this. And the reason is that this bill kind of aimed to put in that third party verification, exactly. Yeah. So this was a really important thing because again, it kind of closes that opportunity for organizations to just say whatever they want. They have to have an organization outside of them externally to then verify those claims. But it'll be interesting to watch and see kind of what happens in this space. And also kind of thinking about this, it's more important than ever now on an individual basis, on a small to medium enterprise business organizational level as well, to really focus on communicating in a way that is really, really transparent, focused, factual, and not over-promising and vague, so that we can then make and normalize that. So that when these other larger companies are doing very vague, fluffy communications, it'll become apparent because more and more people are hopefully interacting with local businesses who are being very, very transparent. So some top tips is kind of responding to greenwashing. It's staying informed and questioning claims as much as possible, particularly when you're dealing with suppliers and partners and collaborators, like asking them questions is very, very important. And then calling it out when you can, or supporting organizations and NGOs that do that, standing with them when they call out greenwashing and understanding what that means. Supporting change, doing things the way that we've always done them is not necessarily going to get us out of the situation that we're in. So it's being prepared and ready to support change, particularly when it comes to policy. It's very important that we have stricter rules, particularly for large and multinational organizations. And finally, backing real solutions, understanding what the solutions really are. Is it recycling or is it eliminating plastic? What are the real solutions? Get behind those, understand them. I included this photo again, and it kind of ties into the picture I had of the signage. So this was the wood from that same fire. And I think, something that I've noticed around sustainability communications is it's one thing to go out online or to build a policy or to talk about things publicly. It's another thing to act on it in the moment. So I had the opportunity here with the Minister for the Circular Economy, and you can see by the expression on my face that I was very seriously having a conversation with him about how cherry laurel was still being sold in our garden centres, and how as a festival we were highlighting this to the public and that we want to see change. So it's not that everyone needs to go to this level, but it's seeking out those opportunities and sticking to the communications that you make around sustainability, your policies, what your organization values and cares about, and bringing it up with people and feeling confident enough to do that. So I know this is quite a fast-paced webinar, but I think the gold is kind of always in the conversation. So what I'd like to do is bring you through what I have been using for years now, which is my favorite practical guide from Julie's Bicycle on communicating sustainability. So these key steps, I suppose, for talking about your action, your art, your business, operations, whatever it might be in the context of the climate crisis. And again, I'm aware that there's a multitude of different industries who have maybe joined us. We obviously do a lot of focus on the creative and arts industry, but I do think that this is relevant for any types of communications. And it's a really, really good guide, and I use it myself and have been for years. So for those of you who haven't heard of Julie's Bicycle, they're a creative climate action charity. They're based in the UK. The EU leg of Julie's Bicycle actually sits in-house with us at Native Events, which is younger than this guide, actually, that relationship. So we've always had a very close collaborative relationship with Julie's Bicycle and really admired the work that they do. There's so much practical resources available online that you can tap into, and they're so handy to use and tailor to your needs. And that's kind of what I've done and what I will bring you through here. So the key steps, just to give you kind of an overview of what this guide includes, it's understanding your audience, defining your communication objectives, understanding how to measure and evaluate them, and then developing that messaging. So you might be looking at this and thinking that is the exact same as any communication strategy. However, it brings the sustainability piece into it. But it is important to note that, this is no different from communications in any other way. It is no different from marketing in any other way. You still need to understand your audience. You still need to connect with them. You still need to find out what matters to them or show them why something should matter to them. Something that's not included in the guide, but that I always like to go back to as a framework, and we use this a lot at Native Events when we're working with different clients, is the spheres of influence. So at the core of this, you've kind of got what you control, your policy, your operations, and your core team. This is really, really important to understand that there's communications involved here too. And those communications should often be built in collaboration with the people in your organization to kind of achieve that buy-in. And that's going to feed out towards those other spheres as well. The second sphere is that lesser control but influence. So they're your suppliers, your stakeholders, your partners. And if you're a creative business, that might be artists and program at a festival, for example. You can still have conversations here. You can still encourage them to engage with you on a sustainability front. You can still have clauses and policies in place that can influence them in the right direction. And what I'd say is it's always important to have those conversations, even if it's not a concrete formal thing, and to understand what they can collaborate with you on. And then the third and final piece is that kind of influence on behavior. So this is arguably some of the most important, which is your audiences. And again, if I'm using a festival example, like you have a very direct experiential influence on your audiences. But I think, thinking about any industry or organization or workplace, most people are interacting with some part of your business. How are you using that opportunity to engage them for action in a positive way for the environment, for example? So something that I would like to highlight is this first table. Now, there's a lot of tables in the guide. They're all really, really useful. But to start kind of looking at and understanding your audience, this kind of maps it out really well from most important to least important audience. And what you'll see is this is tied to a communications objective. So when you think about communications objectives, you might have very specific ones to your organization or your industry. But if you break it down into these kind of three, it's about building your brand, which is kind of like showing your values, enhancing the experience for your audience or your customers. So for example, engaging with you if this is at a festival directly on the ground. And then that final piece is engaging for action. So this is the most important, arguably, where you want people to actually do something or change something or behave in a certain way. And oftentimes, again, when it comes to communications and marketing, this is, people are focused on trying to engage people to buy or purchase something. So we're going beyond that and we're thinking about how they can engage with us in a positive way or engage them for action so that you influence their behaviors further in a societal way.
Influencing those behaviors in turn influences culture.
Exactly. Yeah. So we need to think about what we're trying to achieve. And funnily enough, in the guide, actually, this is in a different order here. But when we're looking at that hierarchy again, the engaging for action is the most important piece in terms of what we're trying to achieve on a sustainability front, enhancing the experience then and building the brand. And you might be thinking, okay, like, my organization, we're doing things, we have certain activities, we're trying to make our activities sustainable. But sometimes, and I'll get to this now, some of the activities that you're doing, they're not going to directly impact your customer, your client, your partner. So how can you leverage what you are doing in those activities to see the change that you might want to see in society? And it feels like, okay, maybe that shouldn't be my responsibility. But as I said, every industry and every person has a responsibility to make the world a better place for society and the environment. So if you start thinking about it from that lens, you can start including that in your communications and it becomes interesting for people. There's more in this guide about understanding your audience, doing a lot more profiling around what they care about and value. Again, if you're familiar with communications, this is something that you're probably already doing, thinking about, what their expectations might be of you, the media channels that they're using, or directly how they're interacting with you on the ground. So it gives you the opportunity to go that bit deeper. And again, it's helpful, particularly if you're coming from a sustainability background and you're not maybe as tied in and clued in with marketing and communications. It will help you frame the sustainability efforts you want to frame with those departments in your organization as well. So it's a really good connect and a really good way to upskill in communications and understand how to frame it so that you can get that to the right people and get that out there. One of the other tables that they have is around the activities that you do in your organization. And as I kind of mentioned, I've taken this toolkit and I've kind of tailored it to my own needs. So I'm going to show you the one that I've created and we're going to share that also afterwards. So you're kind of, again, looking at the objective, which is engaging for action, the activity, what the benefit is to the audience, and then developing that messaging around it. The irony here is that this is all about recycling. Recycling is important, but you know the narrative buster now at this point. So yeah, so this is the one that I did. This is from a festival I did a few years ago, and I just thought I'd include it because this is real, this is rough, and this is what I did to workshop. How am I going to talk about all of these different things? So what I did was I planted it across the impact areas involved at the festival. Now, you may not do this. You might look at it from an activity perspective. If you're working in a particular industry, what are the key activities and the core activities of your business? And then you kind of look at each of those individual activities and see within them, what is it that we can talk about and where is it relevant? So you'll see there on the left-hand side in this column, I've put them in the order of importance, which is, again, engaging for action, enhancing the experience, and then building your brand, showing your impact and your measurement and your values. So energy is a good example, I think, because it's an activity we can talk about, but it's not really one that we're engaging for action directly on a festival site, for example. It's not necessarily enhancing their experience there and then. But also what it can do is educate people and show the measurement that we're doing, build our brand, build a reputation, and then hopefully impact them and influence their behaviors beyond the actual event itself. So, for example, we looked at centralizing power, which again wouldn't be something that audiences would be that familiar with. Energy reduction would be. We switched to LEDs. People might not know how much benefit there is to switching to LEDs. And then we also had a solar box office. You can see there if we are doing again. So this was at the early stages of my planning. So when the attendee experience is unaffected, what are we going to do? We're going to talk about those reduction targets. We're going to talk about how it's more efficient and potentially about those CO2 savings. So this is just kind of how I would break it down again for any, I suppose, clients and collaborators that I'm working with, or even internally at Native Events. Like this is something that we would look at is what are the activities we're doing and why is this relevant to our audience and how can we actually leverage this to have an impact that goes beyond our business and also feeds into the change that we want to see in the world.
I'll also add there, like even for me as a communications lead, like with these things, it's always a question of like, okay, how can we let our audience know why this is sustainable? Like what actually about this is sustainable?
Yeah.
Sometimes people just need those facts, and that's where that transparency piece comes in with greenwashing. You could say that's unsustainable, but you need to provide those facts or that reference or source to show this is less energy than using a generator if we use this battery, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and it's important because again, you might not think, okay, well, it's not affecting the customer on a direct level, but actually them understanding this is going to make them think about things and how other things operate in the world as well, and maybe influence their choices about what they do and don't support. It's important as well, obviously, to keep your communications, again, going back to like everyday communications on brand, personalize them, make them accessible, translate them, keep them positive, and celebrating your achievements. One of the things that maybe isn't included in the guide, maybe it is, but it's more so also about transparently communicating when you've failed at something because our efforts around climate action are really, really important, even if they don't always work out. And it's important, as we kind of said earlier, to be able to call not greenwashing out in yourself necessarily, but calling out where you might have thought that one thing was the right way and maybe it didn't work out as well as you'd planned. And that's an important learning and sharing. And on a human level, really helps people to connect with you and your sustainability efforts because we're all trying to do the right thing and sometimes it's very conflicting. In terms of avoiding greenwashing, the truth test, is what you're saying actually true? Is there evidence to back it up? Are you using fluffy language? Is it very vague? And are you using over-promising imagery? I would argue that this Coca-Cola ad is a little over-promising. I'm not sure what you guys think. I'll let you be the judge of that. So this was kind of me bringing, I suppose, a little bit of my thinking and Native Events' approach to sustainability communications and how we look at greenwashing and how we decode those narratives. So I'm really hopeful that this has been helpful. And as I said, we're going to share the resources, we're going to share the guide, which is really, really fantastic. We're going to share my version, which is just like me making a little toolkit for myself. And I would recommend really if this is something that you're interested in doing and understanding about your organization and how you can talk about the activities, maybe even that you do specifically in your organization, having a look at that toolkit and developing one out for yourself, tailoring it to your needs. That's what I've kind of found been the most useful. So we're going to jump into a chat now with Kira and Aziz, who's also already been here, but also with all of you, I think. So we'll probably stop sharing and let everyone jump into the conversation because I know it's particularly topical and interesting.